Yeah, g'day, my name's Rick. This is to be my overview of the book Dumbing Us Down, John Taylor Gatto, 1990, 25th anniversary since the book and since his acceptance speech of New York State Teacher of the Year. Back in 1990, someone must have made a big mistake giving this grumpy old conservative fellow the platform. Presumably he gave his acceptance speech in front of a bunch of people at a podium. It's basically the equivalent of giving a knighthood to someone and then they sock the Queen in the jaw. Guess someone didn't do their homework, or maybe he wanted to do this all along and kept his intentions secret, which isn't entirely dishonourable. And at any rate, we get this nice book out of it. And I'll go into a little bit more detail in Chapter 2 of what's in that acceptance speech. But generally speaking, this is a book from a teacher's lens of the decline of society. So you could talk about Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West. You could read about what Ivan Illich talks about in Deschooling Society, or even Max Weber's idea of the takeover of bureaucracy in society and things becoming more institutionalized rather than, countryman, people of the dirt, got your own culture, got your own community hall, close-knit, as Gatto will put it, communities, not networks. I don't think that John Taylor Gatto has been influenced by those ideas, or at least not firsthand. It doesn't come through at all. He certainly doesn't talk about it. But that makes it pretty cool too, that he's rediscovered or independently observed these sorts of social changes from the perspective of being a New York public school teacher. So, yeah, there's basically that same sort of premise that you'll hear in those other works I cited, which is that what if school isn't broken? What if school is doing what it's supposed to do? What if it's spectacularly successful? It's just that the results we see, i.e. disenchanted, upset, uneducated, can't read, can't write teachers and children, their pupils, quote unquote, what if that's the plan? What if that's the way it's supposed to be? Even if it's not strictly intentional, maybe that's the development that is happening and sort of the machine is taking over and people are ending up in that position just as nature somewhat intends. As the nature of from going from communities to networks, from going to people of the soil, people with culture, people who do things for themselves, people of the provinces being subsumed into the big mega cities. Maybe that's just a natural process, but we're going to do a quick little zip through and talk about how Gatto has observed this in his school system. Now there are 7 lessons which can constitute a recipe for how this is to be achieved in a school. I'm not going to go through each one of them with my comments. I think you can read the book. I don't want to give the damn thing away, and possibly find them online anyhow. But I will mention the first one because for a long time and famously this is what the book's really all about, and less attention I think is given to the other chapters. There are 5 of them, so I'm going to do a whiz through those. So just quickly, confusion. So, in this sort of society where everyone's in the matrix, where everyone's become little drones, little burger flipping bots who can't read or write very well and can't think for themselves, don't have very much intelligence to contribute to the franchise. Confusion would be an asset, wouldn't it? If they're living in a confused world, they're not going to have radar that tells them, oh, that's funny, the world seems to be all snafu'd. If you can turn that off, it's an advantage, and then you've got better little worker drones. So lesson 1, teach the kids confusion at school. Get their little plastic brains set in cement, thinking situation normal or confused. And how you do that, you fill their heads with jargon, you disconnect things that are connected, you fill them with trivia and nonsense, you move around way too much so that people can't figure out what's going on. Don't come down here, guys, I'm doing a video. Oh no. I better wrap this up. Basically, you're causing the children panic and anger to the point where they can't process it, and then you leave them that way, and that's the first lesson. Now the next part of the chapter is good. Keep walking. Thank you. Come down to the park to be quiet and alone next to the mangroves, and then people come walking their dog down here. Honestly. 25 years, people. 25 years. Don't they have any sense? Great. Alright, yeah, I just wanted to say there's just a hint in this video, or sorry, there's a hint in this book of a conspiracy, that there's some background plan that maybe this is covered in his next book, I think, which I haven't had enough of a look at, but there's an idea that it's reactionary, that there's a problem with black slaves being freed in the USA, there's a problem with immigration, that these new people, the Catholics and the Slavics and the Latinos, they're going to come into our country, say USA for instance, or, you know, all over the show, right here in New Zealand too. They're going to change it, they're going to make things weird, and what we can do is quickly put the system into place to capture them and control them and sanitize them. So that's a very intriguing idea, which I'm interested in, but we don't get much of in this book. But as I say, he might not just be flirting with the idea. I think he's got a fully fledged and developed idea, which I'd like to understand too, and maybe talk about sometime. Anyway, I just finish this with a quote, and then I'll move on to chapter 2. It is, "In our secular society, school has become the replacement for church, and like church, it requires that its teachings must be taken on faith." So chapter 2 is called The Psychopathic School, which is a lovely title for a chapter. And he's stressing again, we live in communities rather than networks, and this to expand the idea. If you've heard of the idea of simulated hospitality, which I saw in a George Clooney movie recently, where you go to a hotel and they act all friendly, or they pick up the phone, and there's all this customer service stuff going on because they don't really know you, they don't really care about you. They're not putting mints under your pillow at the hotel, or giving you flowers, or caring particularly, like the staff in Downton Abbey or something really love and have affection for the people they work for. No, that's simulated hospitality. It makes it look like that. And if you take a closer look, you would cut through the fake warm fuzzy feeling that you're patented on to believe that people like you, people love you, people respect you, and realize that it's just service in exchange for money generally, and not genuine. So this can get a little bit carried away, and it only has any currency where it does tap into the real thing. If that didn't make a hell of a lot of sense, maybe this will work. Think again of airport security, security theatre, the idea of taking your shoes off and going through metal detectors, having your bags checked, getting pat downs, everyone going through a whole lot of drama and theatre ostensibly to protect you from, I don't know, bombs or terrorism or knives being smuggled onto the airplanes or goodness knows what. Now, I assert that a lot of what goes on there is for display purposes only. It doesn't actually help anyone. It's a lot of paranoia and freaking out that accomplishes nothing practically, but instills in the people who are involved the idea that they're doing their job, the security staff are watching every damn thing, and whether they are or not, the theatre is convincing. And again, this is where fantasy takes over from reality. I think that this is basically where Gatto is coming from in the context of schooling, when he talks about people who become networks, not communities, people who become, oh, where is it? There's something nice in here somewhere about that. Basically become well-schooled and irrelevant as human beings. You're not the human being anymore. You're valued for the position in a network that you inhabit. I guess that's a different chapter. Never mind. Anyway, you become mechanical, you become anti-human and unhuman through this process of schooling. That's what the idea of total schooling is. Also, part of this chapter which is interesting is something that Guva Mate writes about in another book, that children become attached to each other, to their peers, rather than their parents. According to Gatto, this has never happened before. This is in defiance of thousands of years of culture and heritage. I don't think that's strictly true. I think, again, something that keeps coming up here is that he thinks that what's going on here is peculiar to his experience in the late 20th century, whereas really I think this is an ongoing process that always happens, but we don't need to get into that particularly. It's just the part of the life cycle of civilizations, that they break down like this. They become far too technocratical and institutionalized, and maybe the sweet spot is in between sort of your barbaric Scots or your Gurkha guardsmen or your American Indians or your Maori warriors, and then you come into more civilization and control in cities and cement and electricity, and then society goes to hell. Maybe just in between is where we want to put things. That's more of a Jim Penman problem than what we're dealing with here. In section 6, he calls for a rigorous national debate. Sorry, a ferocious national debate. Highly naive. I think that also speaks to the idea that John Taylor Gatto thinks this is a one-off degenerative thing, and that it can be fixed by people talking about it. That does seem to fly in the face of the idea that the school system is a big juggernaut that is doing what it wants to do. That it could just be fixed with a bit of debate, a bit of a ferocious debate, mind you. But no, you're not going to turn this thing around like that. Although, it's consistent with the idea that he has that you can turn it around by exposing the central myths of the school system, basically blowing away the theatre and the simulation and finding out what's really going on. But I think that that's not sufficiently giving credit to how well the system works, how well people are enmeshed in the system. They'll fight this, they'll get very angry, and he'll get thrown in the creek. There'll be no such debate. It would just be a ridiculous ostracism exercise for people to speak up, although he's written this book, and I'm appreciating it, a lot of people do, but you can't take it to the central discourse. So that's very naive. And he ties in quite intelligently, of course, that when people are treated this way, they become institutionalized like this. They turn to the weapons of social pathology. So there's indifference, there's drugs, there's violence, there's self-destruction. So what you see in the victims in terms of symptoms, and as he says, in terms of fighting back, is the drug taking and the antisocial behavior that emerges from this unhealthy attachment. Moving on to chapter 3. This one's called The Green Monogalia. This is the name of a river where the fellow grew up. It's a first prize winning essay, apparently. Basically a chapter before his advertising days when he was a kid, harking back to trains and riverboats back in, I think, Pennsylvania, where he grew up, and they had iridescent ticks, and they would play, probably in places like this, as I have with my little boy, picking up crabs, doing things in nature rather than being stuck in classrooms. And he says that the men of the riverboats would take some time out, and the men of the trains too, to talk to the local kids and show them how things worked. Have a good old chat. So it's, sort of a look back at the good old days. Why can't we do that anymore chapter? Which fits the theme. But again, it's a little bit naive, and it flies in the face of what I'll only assert, which is that this is a process. We've become technocratical. We've got the mega cities now. Where he grew up is just a province that just gets drained of its talent and its people, and it's the backwoods now, whereas in the past it would have been its own central hub, and it would have made sense for people to live like he did. But these days, things have changed, and it's not simply a matter of turning back the clock and, I don't know, bringing back paddle steamers or encouraging truck drivers or something to spend some time with children. Now, anyway, let's move on to the next chapter. Chapter 4 is actually a lovely little essay about anarchism, and it fits into this book very well. This is called We Need Less School, Not More, and this is the chapter which talks about networks and how networks only want a piece of you. So if you're in your table tennis club, they don't want the whole you, at least in the context we're speaking. You can imagine back in the day when it's a real community enterprise, they might be much more personal and much more interested in what you can do and whether you can maybe bake. And then again, that immediately brings forth the idea, you know, what you can bring to the club in terms of fundraising and about table tennis. Can you play? Can you provide transport? Can you bake so that maybe we can get some nice snacks at the end of the table tennis match? Those sorts of things. So it sort of slices off who you are qua table tennis, or who you are with respect to the particular club and what it needs from you. And that contributes to the smooth running of that particular enterprise. That's what you're there for. That's your mutual group interest. But it also alienates the rest of you. So Gatto's concern is if you live in these sorts of groups, you're increasingly cutting yourself off and experiencing life as a series of artificial slices. You're living a scripted life and just giving a quality of yourself and not the whole you to these relationships. And this transfers over into marriages and into one's approach to schooling and education. So we resemble a dramatic act. It's like it's been scripted. It's like we're on some cheap soap opera or something. We're having level 5 conversations or something, like small talk, how's the weather, and just going through the robotic motions instead of talking about our real thoughts and feelings with somebody else. That's the downside. And he suggests one of the symptoms is that you forget names and faces, which I think is probably true. I know some public school kids, these days they don't know the names of their teachers. And if they do, I think they wouldn't talk about it. They instead refer to their school teachers as Mr. Hey Mr. or Miss more often because mostly female. Here's a great quote that isn't the only one in this chapter, but it's the one I'm going to read. Belonging to many networks does not add up to having a community, no matter how many you belong to or how often your telephone rings. There's some other great little lines and ideas like the paraphernalia of servitude that come out of this chapter, but I'm not going to go through all of those. I think you certainly would benefit from reading it. Something that popped out to me here was this idea that the most successful knockoffs in terms of networking, in terms of this artificial takeover, borrow their function and their form from what works in families, what works in true community. And the example he appears to have given, unless I put this in myself, but I think this is, yeah, I wouldn't have written the word injunction, so Kennedy's injunction. If you remember the 1961 famous speech from President Kennedy, ask not what you can do for yourself. Well, it's famous in America, not so much over here. But I think it goes like this. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Now, that, I think, was quoted with approval, but what Gatto wouldn't have realised, because it's only the discovery of a 2011 article, is that this indeed has been stolen from community that came before. Apparently, first thing I found on Google when I had a quick look at this is that Kennedy did steal that line from his old high school principal. So it's interesting that he's borrowing from school and that this sort of psychopathic school ends up on the presidential lectern. And that takes us to, I should say, the paraphernalia of servitude quote because it's so damned interesting. Official favour, grades, or other trinkets of subordination have no connection with education. They are the paraphernalia of servitude, not freedom. Now, if I could unpack that a little bit, I'm thinking the awards that kids get, the marks, the little gold stars. People think that this is the true value, but actually the more that these little trinkets are fawned over, the more deep into servitude someone is, the more they value them. So, to illustrate that, think of, say, a teacher's pet or something who keeps on getting the cup or the stickers, or doesn't get their name on the board, or gives the teacher an apple, or sits there with their arms folded like a good little kid and doesn't cause any trouble. They're deeper into the matrix, you see. They're all the more looking up to the system and bought into the system, and have their independence and their self-esteem caught up in the approval not of themselves but of others, and particularly of the system. Alright, last chapter and we're out of here. Our final chapter is the congregational principle, and in this Gatto goes back to the past, to colonial New England, which, fitting in with our Spengler and our Weber, it makes sense that back in the day, before things got so mega-citied up with the big growth of government and the state and the system, people had it going on, and his idea is we could go backwards to that. Of course, this doesn't make sense from the perspective that I'm putting forth, that it's like the butterfly going back to the caterpillar. You can't do that. Now, it's an interesting little jam through talking about how great things were in New England back in the day, which is not what Hollywood tells us. When I think of colonial New England, I think of the Warlock movie, where things are pretty shitty, and I think of the Crucible, Henry Miller's play, and I think it's Winona Ryder getting burned as a witch or something like that. You know, in Salem, having witch trials, which is one of these New England colonies. But anyway, that's what they want us to think. Maybe the same way they corrupt the Old West, that it's all about shootouts and desperation and death and disease. Maybe that's a clue that it indeed is not that sort of thing. And what's going on with the congregationalism, with the congregational principle, something that I think Gordon Tullock, the economist, would be very pleased to note, is that things do not work better as a super city. Things work better when everyone's got their own little clique and they can, sort of Darwinian style, do what works for them. And if it doesn't work, you know, people will vote for their feet and move around to the various communities, and spontaneous order emerges. So I think, again, without being read in it or exposed to these ideas, John Taylor Gatto, quite cleverly, is coming up with his own theory of spontaneous order, or he's picking it out of the colonial past, and with appreciation. He calls them laboratories of local choice and style. He also seems to be, well, he's talking about price signals, and it's like an Austrian understanding, as I've written here, but I already said that. It also reminds me of hippies in the 1960s, to a point where maybe I shouldn't get into that, keep this short. They're sort of going back, and it doesn't really work. It didn't work for them. This is butterfly into a caterpillar kind of a thing. It also reminds me that his colonial New England is the Athenian ideal that I think Homer wrote about Hector this way, of being good at every damn thing, not being a specialized insect, but being what was called the Renaissance man in the Renaissance. So I think these eras have something in common, and the sort of human or person that they favor is a well-rounded person, someone who can do a bit of everything. He can skin a sheep, he can pluck a lyre, he can cook a dinner, he can run, and he can jump, and he can throw, and he can be a good dad and a good mum, just super duper well-rounded. And that's the way things were, and by necessity, in the primitive cultures before things get too damn civilized and specialized. So, you know, he's right, and I can totally see that, and I can see that social engineering is not anything but a sad parody of people doing social change from the heart and as a community, and that these sorts of problems and challenges that are currently solved by bureaucracies were and can most effectively and perhaps only be solved by people in communities. But winding back the clock again, I don't think Gatto's able to see that from his perspective. You cannot go backwards. Maybe you can found a new community somewhere and civilizations do splinter off and start again, but and that's what I think the hippies were doing back in the 60s, particularly the ones who founded their own communes. They're trying to replicate what their great-grandfathers did in colonial times and failed. Anyway, that's my wrap-up, although I should point out his way forward is to starve the victims. Or not starve the victims, they're already starving. Starve the system of victims. Get kids out of the school, because it's not going to change, it can't be reformed. And that is something I do agree with, but I think it clashes with the other things that Gatto says. So thanks for watching. I'm glad I've finally wrapped this thing up and before the year finished.